Welcome to Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your host, Randy Isaac, and I'm here on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation. And here we have discussions featuring authors of publications and books that are reviewed in our journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. And you're welcome to join us at 2 p.m. Eastern Time every second Saturday of the month. Everything is recorded, so you'll be able to hear this in the future as well. Today, we complete our coverage of the December 2022 issue of the journal, and we are discussing the article entitled An Anatomist Considers Overflow at the Boundaries of Being a Person, authored by none other than Gareth Jones. And we're delighted to have Gareth Jones join us all the way from New Zealand. Welcome, Gareth.
Thank you very much.
All right.
It's good morning from me.
That's right. 8 a.m. your time. So that's terrific. Yeah. So you didn't have to get up too early.
Not too badly, no.
That's great. Well, it's great. Gareth, you have published quite a bit in our journal and spoken. So I suspect that probably at least half of this audience is very familiar with your name, if not more. But there'll be a few people who haven't heard it, but I think most of us probably just know your work more than we know you. So let's take a little bit of time and get to know you a little better. So I take it you're a native New Zealander. That's safe to say, right?
No.
No. Okay. That's not so safe. All right. So where were you born and raised? Where were you born and raised?
As my name suggests, I'm Welsh. And I was brought up in a mining valley of South Wales, a very industrial valley. So that's where I was brought up. And I spent my childhood there until I disappeared to medical school in London, to University College London.
Word. So how were you motivated to leave the beautiful Wales?
Well, it's not all beautiful. As I say, it was very much a mining valley. Which is where I was brought up, although there was some very nice countryside not too far away. But I still say that, when I went up into the loft of our house, my parents' house, I could see the hills, but the hills were black. Mm-hmm. And the black, of course, is that they were all sort of coal sludge. Mm-hmm. And of which there was a great deal of that around at the time. It would be different now. And so, yes, that's where I was brought up.
Wow, that's interesting. So in that context and culture, what was your faith background? What kind of faith environment were you raised?
Well, my faith background was I was brought up in a theologically liberal church. It was a Baptist church, but it was pretty liberal. Mm-hmm. And I became a Christian not through that church at all. But I think the thing is that during my teens, I became increasingly interested in religious and philosophical issues. Mm-hmm. Although at the same time, I was very much attracted to scientific humanism and evolutionary humanism, because it seemed to me that this provided a very broad vistas for our understanding of the world. And I found that very exciting. But I think over a period of about 3 years, religious perspectives took an increasing hold on me, and I gradually got closer to the Christian faith, but I certainly wasn't there. But I eventually became a Christian through some evangelical preachers, not in the church that I was brought up. And that was just a month or so before I went to London and to university,
so
which
that was
actually
very good. Yeah. Okay.
That was still in Wales, yes.
Okay.
Before I left for London.
All right. So where were you in London then, and what were you doing there?
Well, I was at medical school at University College London. Mm-hmm. So I suppose I went to become a doctor, but I sort of never mentioned, well, I became a doctor, but I never actually practiced clinically. I went straight into neuroanatomical research at University College. Because I found that what really stimulated me intellectually were research questions. And so I went into neuroanatomical research. But I think the thing about London was I went there as a very, very young Christian, and I came under two very different influences, but both of them were very influential on me. And so once in London, I came under the influence of Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones with his strongly reformed biblical preaching. And he taught me, though, also to think and to analyze issues from a biblical base. So that was one very important influence. The other one that I was influenced in was in my scientific thinking by J.Z. Young, who was professor of anatomy. And he was a profound and exciting thinker from a humanistic base. So I had these two contrasting influences, but both of them showed me how to write and assess arguments and never to be content with simple answers. And so each of those in a different way opened up quite new vistas to me. And as I say, they were proved hugely influential. But also there was a third person, someone called Dr. Oliver Barclay, who I'm sure wouldn't be a well-known name. At the time, he was leading the Research Scientist Christian Fellowship in the UK, which is now known as Christians in Science. And he got me writing in my early 20s, first on evolutionary topics, but then I started looking into bioethical questions. And I went into those because of the link with neuroscience and with reproductive biology. The thing was that at first, bioethics was a hobby. And I assumed that after a few years, I'd get fed up with it and had no intention that it would be long term. But something, well, very difficult at the time, completely changed that. And that was 1984, when my first book in the area, Brave New People, encountered, as some of you will know, virulent opposition in the United States. And it was withdrawn from publication by IVP. And I think what was so influential for me then was, on the one hand, it forced me to consider whether I was a Christian. And if I was, whether I could possibly continue to write in this area as a Christian. And I came very, very close to ditching my faith. Because after all, here were well-known Christians telling me in no uncertain terms I wasn't a Christian and that I was very much on my way to hell. And I only survived because of the very strong foundation that I had over the previous years in biblically based theological thinking. But it did make me very critical of the tactics used by those Christians who were prepared to tear people like me to shreds in order they could win a socio-political battle. And the result was that my future writing changed completely from evolutionary questions to bioethical ones, because I was forced to pay very close attention to issues around early development, far more detail than I had previously.
And so you found that safer ground to write about?
None of this ground is safe, no. And I accept that every single thing I touch is controversial. I don't expect anything that I write to be not controversial. I'm provocative, not because I want to be, but because it's an inherent part of what I'm looking at. But the thing was then that I then developed bioethics as an academic pursuit. And I've written extensively in academic journals and with academic publishers on many topics that interface of biomedicine, anatomy, and ethics. And of course, one of the good things of being in anatomy was that the base of anatomy and the history of anatomy is terribly, dreadfully unethical. I mean, it's appalling. And so you've got to say, well, look, here I am as an anatomist with this incredibly bad base. How do I sort this out? How do I live? And so I write sometimes explicitly as a Christian for a Christian audience, but on other occasions, I write far more for a general audience. But when I write for a general audience, my intention is that whatever I say is informed by my basic Christian values. Right. And I think this is shown particularly by one textbook. 3 of us wrote this textbook, Medical Ethics, and it went through 4 editions and was published by Oxford. And what was interesting there was the other 2 authors, both of them were Christians from rather different theological backgrounds. But we saw this book as standing in opposition to the secular utilitarian emphases of certain other bioethicists. And so while it's no way explicitly Christian, we feel that very much Christian values underlie it.
Right. Okay. So let me take you back a little bit and ask you about how you got your connection with the ASA. Our records show that you joined the ASA in early 1974 and published your first article in our journal in the December 74 issue, which may have been controversial at the time. I wasn't a member yet, but The Making of Man. And anyway, but how did you learn about the ASA and how did you join?
I'm not sure. There was one real influential person. That was Dick Bube.
Ah, yes.
And I got to know Dick, and I stayed with him when I was at Stanford on one occasion. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we corresponded a great deal in those early years. And I think the thing is that when you live in somewhere like New Zealand, you don't have a strong local organization.
Right.
And so fairly obviously, I still have, and over the years, had considerable connections with the UK organizations, because obviously that's where I'm from.
Right.
And
right.
I still would know many people in it.
Right.
And so, to have connections with the American organization as well as the UK organization made a lot of sense.
It does. So you can always start a chapter in New Zealand, and I'm sure Dana would be happy to work with you on that. But let's hear about how you came to New Zealand from London.
Well, I was a few years in London at University College, a very prestigious department. And people then thought I made a quite outlandish move when I moved to Australia. And I moved to Australia, to Perth, to University of Western Australia. And the thing is that I was, I think, looking for another department which would be research oriented. Now, a lot of anatomy departments are not research oriented, and I wanted it to be. And there was this new department in Perth, in Western Australia. And as it happened, the professor at the head of the department at the time was a Christian. And I thought I could really sort of start from scratch and start things up there. And so I took that move, and I was there for 13 years. And, it was very much a home for our family, and 3 of our children were born there. But then I was looking for an anatomy chair, and that's when I moved in 83 to New Zealand and to the University of Otago, where I could see there are opportunities for developing the anatomy department as a strong research-based department. And also, I started a bioethics center there in the university. And so there were these opportunities then to develop in both the research front and also, I think, in the ethics front as well. Although at that time, my research was very much neuroscience.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent trajectory, and you've really pursued in depth these particular fields. Let's talk a bit more specifically about this article, but before we get to that point, I noticed that your most recent book came out last fall, and on the margins.
At the margins. I don't know if you can see it.
At the margins, right. Well, Dana, why don't you put that? Why don't you put the link to that book on the chat so people can take a look at it? It's your hot. I don't know if your article was an excerpt out of that, but you've come out with another fine book. But by the way, you mentioned Brave New People. Was that your first book, or had you already come out?
No, I had published again with IVP prior to that, Our Fragile Brains.
Okay, fragile.
Which should have been very controversial in places, but it didn't tend to be. But that obviously was my neuroscience, right. And that was aiming to have a Christian perspective on a whole range of issues in neuroscience, issues which were very much at the forefront then. One would write a rather different book these days, but I haven't had time to get around to another one on neuroscience.
Okay, so let's talk about the article we're featuring today, the consideration of overflow at the boundaries of being a person. What led up to this particular article, and what's the focus? And then I'll ask you a little bit more about the content.
Well, I think simply, Jim Peterson was wanting something on personhood. And so I thought I would do something. So that very simply was what led to, well, I thought it was so obviously my field, I should have a go at it.
Okay, excellent. All right, so was it building off material you typically put out, isn't it? So tell us a little bit more about this article now. Obviously, you're dealing with the topic of personhood and the boundaries, but you give us a very brief overview here, and then we'll start talking about it.
Well, I mean, I think the thing that what underlies all my ethical thinking is that I function as a practitioner. I'm not a theoretician, and this means I am repeatedly faced with what I would call compromises and uncertainties. But I accept these as basic facts of life. So, my concerns are always pastoral, and I expect to have to cope with murkiness and tentativeness in all sorts of areas. And so I think what underlies this is that I live within what sometimes appear to be, I think, two completely contradictory worlds. I'm a biomedical scientist, and while I might have written on bioethics for a long time now, I mean, my background and my thinking is very much as a biomedical scientist. But I'm also a biblically based follower of Christ. So, as obviously I've said, I'm an anatomist, and I have considerable interest in early development and the reproductive technologies. But of course, I repeatedly hear from some of my Christian friends and Christian writers that human life begins at conception or at fertilization, and that no faithful Christian can possibly allow a single human embryo to be modified or destroyed. I'm told by some, and sometimes in great detail, that every embryo is loved by God and must be protected at all costs. And obviously, for someone like me, here is a huge dilemma immediately, because it gives the impression that I must make a choice. I write as a Christian, and if I do that, it tells me that I must turn my back on the biomedical sciences and have nothing more to do with them. It tells me I have to reject all that I stand for and all the new technologies that are becoming available. Now, people may not say this explicitly, but this is what follows. Because some, at least, see it because the biomedical sciences seem to be in opposition to the Christian faith. So I either go along that track and reject my biomedical science and say I'm a good Christian, or I reject this dichotomy and I reject the view that full personhood commences at fertilization. But if I adopt this position, I can be a biomedical scientist and a faithful Christian. Question is, of course, how can I do this? How is it possible? Well, one approach is what I've dealt with in this article, what I have termed overflow. And as I said in the article, the idea is that here is a river, it's overflowing its banks, or here's a hall overflowing with people. In both cases, the water or the people are spilling out from a well-defined container into a surrounding space that takes on the characteristics of the river or the hall. Now, what I've tried to do is to say, well, because I'm an anatomist, and as I've said, one of my main stances for which I'm actually known, I'm best known in academic areas, is that I write on the dead body. How should the dead body be treated? Do we cease to be persons immediately on our death? Now, there's huge uncertainty here. My aim has been to protect the dead human body and to ensure it's respected. But of course, there's uncertainty on its status. And so as I look at both extremes of human life, there are equivalent but not identical uncertainties over the notion of personhood in its earlier stages and at the time of death. And for me, it's unwise to be categorical in either situation. And so, as I've said, one way of approaching these uncertainties is to start from where we are certain that a human person is present, and then move gradually towards the extremes. In other words, to move from the certain to the uncertain. And so I use this concept then of overflow to give these marginal persons the benefit of the doubt. In other words, what I'm saying is those who are perhaps not conclusively persons are compared favorably to those who are unquestionably persons. Now, personhood is defined in all sorts of ways. And I don't try and get into any great issues here. But for me, persons are those made in the image of God, with a uniqueness and an ability to live in relationship with God and with other persons. But as we know, all is not straightforward at the peripheries, backward into the past or forward into the future. Now, in my view, the standing of early embryos is uncertain, as is the standing of the recently deceased. Or in more personal terms, when did other people first recognize you and me as persons? And when in the future will others cease to treat you and me as persons? And so, what I do in this article, if I can say just a few things about them, I work this out in several contexts. The first is to approach those who have recently died. At what point after death do human beings cease being persons and needing to be treated with respect and afforded dignity as human persons? Now, it's interesting. This is not an area to which Christians give much attention. Perhaps surprisingly, it's not a controversial area within the church. After all, you'll find very few articles, let alone books on this from a Christian angle. But how do we treat the recently deceased? What biblical and what theological directions do we actually have? That's the first. The second area I move into is the remote.
Beauteous? Are you beauteous?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Secondly, I move into the remote past and the question of digging up human skeletal remains by biological anthropologists. How do we as Christians view these remains that represent people who were once alive but died, and they might have died a long time ago? These remains tell us an enormous amount about how these people lived and even what they believed. How should we treat these skeletal remains as images of God? And then coming back to the present day, the next area I look at is you probably encounter the large public exhibitions of plastinated dissected human bodies. But this technique of plastination, which is well known to anatomists and also to some zoologists, it preserves dead human bodies ad infinitum, and I mean ad infinitum, really forever, in lifelike states. Now, this is an excellent technique for teaching health science students. But what concerns people is not about that, is these exhibitions in which whole plastinated individuals can be demonstrated in ways that suggest they're still alive and are doing the sorts of things that living people do, whether it's playing basketball, being a ballerina, playing chess, or whatever. This is what these exhibitions are largely about. When displayed in these ways, though, the plastinated humans have become ambivalent entities. They are part human tissue, and they're part plastic. Do we treat them with the respect we would show towards the recently deceased? And how do we approach them? Now, any Christian leaders who have commented on them publicly, they conclude they're disrespectful, but they fail to give convincing theological reasons why this might be the case. And apart from me, I'm not sure if any other Christians have actually written about them. Now, I'm a long way of getting then to early development in embryos. But embryonic development is a gradual process. And this is true however we view it theologically. The ambivalence we've encountered with some of these other forms is again present here, whether we like it or not. Biblical passages used in discussions on the personhood of early development, they're helpful. I certainly think they're helpful, but they're far removed from the embryos encountered in the lab or the clinic. Blastocysts, the inner cell mass, the primitive streak, the trophectoderm, they were all unknown to any of the biblical writers. In other words, this is foreign territory to Scripture, and I think it's unhelpful to suggest otherwise. Now, this doesn't mean that we demean these early developmental stages. I certainly don't think that. But we interpret their significance retrospectively, what they will become, what they will represent in God's economy. We value them because they are part of God's creation and that they will be precious in His sight. Now, I have absolutely no doubt we treat them with immense care by providing them with a nurturing and a profoundly loving environment. And those of us who are his people are called to be their guardians, doing all we can to ensure their well-being. But does this mean we're to try and protect them under all circumstances, regardless of the consequences? Does this mean we are never to attempt to learn more about the earliest stages of human development, nor about ways in which the medical profession can reduce rates of infertility or treat early developmental abnormalities? In other words, does protection of the embryo override all of these other considerations? And so my use of the concept of overflow then is that equivocal entities, whichever ones they might be, they are to be given the benefit of the doubt, aiming to provide them with as much dignity as possible. And to me, this is a gesture of hope. It points to God's love for them and our high regard for them. But it also recognizes that our protection of any humans at any stage can never be absolute. After all, we are all limited and we're all sinful beings. And so the final thing then is the embryo is a neighbor to those making decisions about his future. It's a stranger encountered by the Good Samaritan, in need of recognition as a fellow human being, even when this isn't certain. And what I see as the ethical task for Christians is to determine how much we are willing to sacrifice to protect the early embryo, as well, of course, as the deceased, and how much can this be justified. And I think that the overflow principle at least serves as a starter for our ethical thinking. It's never going to answer all our ethical questions, our theological problems, of course not. But I think it's a useful starter, and that's really as far as I am aiming to take it.
Okay. Wow. That's a great summary of the article. Thank you very much. And plenty of ground to discuss, and will take a while. And Dana, if you open the microphones here, we'll start with those who submitted questions in advance, and then we'll open the floor to others. And just as a reminder, if you would go to the icon that says reactions at the bottom of your page, you can click on reactions and then click on raise hand if you want to say something, and then unmute yourself when I call upon you. Now, we had a couple of questions in advance, and first on the list was Del Coons. Del, good to see you again. If you could unmute and ask Gareth your question.
No.
Yeah, well, you were there for a little bit. You're back on mute.
Am I off?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can't see you though, but hey, well, your mute is toggling. You're back on mute. Your microphone is wanting to be muted. All right.
Okay, I guess my computer isn't cooperating today. The video isn't either, but while it looks like it's working, thank you for the article, and I appreciate the width you've taken on both banks of the river analogy, and it's given us some things to really think about. On the far edge of the embryo, kind of a question. I noticed that the International Society for Stem Cell Research is suggesting that the normal 14-day limit on human embryo research be lifted. And my understanding is that limit is as much practicality for keeping an embryo alive as it is for the development of the primitive streak at about 14 or 15 days. And I wonder whether, instead of lifting the guideline, whether it should be restricted more toward the 7-day point, with my thinking being that at around 5 to 7 days, the innate property of the embryo is to separate into two types of cells, inner cells that become the individual and outer cells that interface with the environment. And the only reason after that point that an embryo doesn't continue to develop is not innate to the embryo, but that the researcher has elected not to put it into a nurturing environment. And I'm just noting that the 7-day mark then is also kind of consistent with the in vitro fertilization practice of implanting the embryo 2 to 5 days after the egg has been harvested. So I wonder what your thinking is about that, recognizing that your expertise is on the other bank of the river with anatomy.
Okay. Yeah, well, look, I think, I've got a lot of sympathy with all the points that you make. Perhaps I can say just a few things about the primitive streak and sort of why there's so much emphasis on it. I mean, the primitive streak, which has been known to embryologists for many, many years, it probably was unknown to the general public before at least the mid-1980s at the earliest. And it emerged very much in the debate on research on human embryos and in the ethical issues around them. And the thing is that I think the discussion around embryo research has really walked on thin ice because some want the ability to do as much research as possible on human embryos, whereas many others within societies recognize there is something significant or special about human embryos and that there should be limits on how much research can be done, or at least until when it can be done. So there's very much a fine line here. And I think also within societies, they're coping all the time with, on the one hand, some scientists who would want to have open slather on research, well, although I would say that would not be a majority opinion. And of course, on the other hand, what I would call the sort of the playing God contingent, who would very much like to see no research at all. And so societies, many of them, have really had to cope with this. Now, the thing is why I think they jumped on the primitive streak, because it's a transitory marker. It's at 15 to 16 days of development. But I mean, as you said, before the primitive streak appears, there's the huge amount of development occurring, et cetera, et cetera. And I won't go into that. But I think the primitive streak was chosen, rightly or not, because it instigates the appearance of the neural plate. And the neural plate is the very first stages in the development of the nervous system. But the nervous system itself doesn't really appear until at least 21 days of development. And so you have got, I think, a real mixture of things going on here, partly biological, partly social, partly political, and partly probably theological, or certainly ethical. And so the 14 days has served, I think, as an amazingly successful tool to allow research, but also to limit it. And I think, as it's now existed for about 40 years, it has been amazingly successful and justified from a whole range of different perspectives. Now, the thing is that it does have an arbitrary side to it, and there's no two ways about that. Most countries accepted 14 days. There have been a very small number of countries who actually opted years ago for 7 days, but that never took off. And the possibility of extending it to 21 days has been around for quite some time, although, as you say quite rightly, it's now become something far more, I suppose, pressured or popularized by the International Stem Cell Association. So 7 days is a possibility, and I think in purely biological terms, it makes a great deal of sense. But it simply has never attracted much support. Now, that might be a very, very pragmatic statement to make, but it simply hasn't. Now, the thing is that there has been no great pressure to extend the 14 days because it's very difficult to keep human embryos growing much beyond, until recently anyway, 10 to 11 days. But I would have to say the 21-day limit, whether you like it or not, or whether one should go in that direction, it actually does make some sense in terms of when the neural and the brain features actually appear. So I'm not advocating for one rather than another. I will just simply say that in purely pragmatic terms, 21 days has worked. 14 days has worked. 7 days, I think, in terms of what you say, is a possibility. It obviously then would allow far less in the way of research, but I think it is a possibility. But I don't think it would attract much support. So that, in a sense, is not a very satisfactory situation, but I think that's where we find ourselves.
Okay. So help me a little bit, the status. Dell seemed to say the 14-day period has been dropped already, or?
Oh, no, it hasn't been.
That's just under consideration.
It is being pushed by the Stem Cell Society that we could move to 21 days, as of course have other people and other biologists over the years. Oh no, the 14 days still is very much the standard.
Okay, so the leading push to change that has been to go to 21?
And that would be, again, because it allows more research. So
Okay.
that would be on sort of scientific type lines.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting. And at what level does that get approved? So you said this is internationally across most countries, right?
Well, of course, most countries make their own regulations and their own legislation. So it's really up to each individual country as to where they go. But it simply is that most countries have gone for the 14 days. Now, that doesn't justify it, but that is the reality. And that has satisfied most constituencies most of the time, except, of course, for the very extremes who would not accept it under any circumstances.
Yeah, and they would be pushing for 0 or something.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, they would. And I mean, being in New Zealand, we have a very strange situation here where, in terms of legislation, research up to 14 days is allowed, but it doesn't take place. It doesn't take place because of the particular act that we have got, which says that the Minister of Health has to approve of it. And I won't go into the details because they get a bit difficult, but in a sense,
Right.
It comes down to the Minister of Health has to approve. The Minister of Health doesn't approve or doesn't doesn't say what he or she thinks, then we can't go ahead with any research. There's no research in New Zealand. Although, if you read the legislation, it says it is possible up to 14 days. So it's a very strange situation. It's again being debated afresh at the moment. What it means, of course, is, but it also is a very strange situation here because we allow IVF. So we have IVF, we have embryo destruction that goes with IVF, but in terms of any of the research going on, we simply take what goes on in Australia, pretty close. So I find it very disingenuous ethically.
Okay. All right. Very helpful. Thank you so much. It's a good question there, Dell. All right. Our next question is David Singer. David, I see you there. Thank you for joining. If you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, I really appreciate, Gareth, your attempts at defining personhood, or at least exploring what we mean by personhood. Many years ago, back in the mid-'70s, I was a new art director at Christianity Today magazine. And we had someone write the Christmas story. Tom Howard wrote an article, The Incarnation, the Imagery Matters. As art director, I called Tom up. I knew Tom, and I said, Tom, how about we change the title to God Before Birth and show a human fetus? And Tom liked that idea. And I noticed that in your article, you use a lot of biblical references talking about conception, but you say they are all retroactive and they're looking towards what's going to happen. And I noticed that you don't mention the one place at the very beginning in Matthew 1:20, where the angel talks to Joseph, says, "Fear not to take unto thee Mary for your wife, because that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit." And that's not retrospective. And I was wondering if you would comment on that.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that question. I use those particular Old Testament passages because they're the ones which are invariably used by evangelicals. So, I mean, they are, in a sense, the foundations of how many evangelicals approach these issues. I think what you raise in terms of the birth of Jesus, and I think the birth of John the Baptist as well, they do seem to be rather different. And what I would say here is that in both those cases, you're dealing with unique situations. Obviously, foretelling the birth of John the Baptist and then foretelling the birth of Jesus. And I think they are unique situations for which I think we're to be very, very grateful. What I feel about the Matthew passage is that I think Joseph needed to have a message, because after all, from what you quoted, or verses 19, 20, around then of Matthew 1, Joseph needed to have a message, because after all, he was wanting to, quietly put Mary aside because it was totally socially unacceptable that she should be pregnant. And so he was going to, and I think in the words of Matthew 1:19, to dismiss her quietly. Now, obviously, what we're dealing with here was a unique birth of an individual with a unique status and a unique message. And I think it wasn't a conception along any normal or biological lines. It was certainly miraculous. And I think in no way, though, can we move from this to the significance of other embryos conceived in quite different ways. And I think these particular passages, while I think they are exceedingly interesting in every way and very important, they don't actually count for anything specific in the discussion about what we do with embryos or fetuses. They certainly show, though, I think, the importance of the body from the earlier stages of development. And that, I think, is something which is of huge significance for those of us who write from a Christian angle. And I think this is what you find so much in this whole area, that whatever biblical evidence we have, and I am extremely grateful for the biblical evidence, so often is talking about individuals, so often is talking about unique situations. Fairly clearly, that is the context. Whereas when we are looking at these bioethical issues, we are looking at whole populations. And we are looking at, the one thing I say is it's very difficult, it seems to me, to move from a specific situation where God was working in a specific way in a specific person, to look then to ask, well, what is the value of every single embryo that has ever been conceived? And I think we are getting into quite different territory here. So does that answer your question, or at least sort of address it?
It certainly, you do address it. I guess I struggle with the mystery of what it is to be a person.
Oh, yeah.
And I still think that remains an unknown.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. I have no doubt about that. And it's fascinating when you look at definitions of a person, given in all sorts of various places. Some of them range from being very specific, probably far too specific, to being exceedingly general. And so that, I think, is why, I think that's why I sort of said, well, we are made in the image of God, with a uniqueness and ability to live in relationship with God and with other persons. And I think it's the potential of being able to give of oneself for another and to live together in a human community. Now, none of this, of course, is straightforward at any peripheries. The two peripheries that I looked at, the deceased, and of course the early embryos. But of course, you have other peripheries, which I didn't touch on, people who've got, say, very severe mental deficiencies or massive congenital malformations. To what extent they are persons? Well, again, I very much give them the benefit of the doubt. That's why I don't like to try and specify too specifically and too particularly exactly what is a person. To me, a person is someone like us, made in the image of God, with whom we can interact, or we can potentially interact, and we are to look after, as they are part of our human community.
Does your conception of personhood, though, allow for the end of personhood? You say we become less of a person after we die.
Well, I mean that's the point I'm trying to distinguish when we do. You see, in much of my anatomical writings, anatomical ethical writings, I very, very much emphasize, when we're looking at getting bodies for dissection in anatomy departments, that all that I think is we should get donated bodies. In other words, people who have people and their close families say, we want our body to be used in this particular way after our death. In other words, they give their informed consent. I am very concerned about the use of bodies for which there which are unclaimed bodies, no consent. And I think the reason why I would make this emphasis is to say, well, it is important that we emphasize as much as we can informed consent, that the people want certain things to be done to their bodies or not done to them, as opposed simply to society or whoever deciding, here's someone who's dead, let's just use their body for good purposes. So that is, again, trying to ensure that even when someone has died, that we want to know what they or their loved ones would have wanted to happen to the body. So whether or not they're still persons, again, gets into fairly murky territory. But I think it's giving the benefit of the doubt to those who have now died.
Yeah, let me build on that, Gareth, a little bit, because I think Dave is on a key point here towards the end of life. And almost all of your discussion seems to be concerned with the recently deceased. But on the other side of the line here, how would your concepts be applied to the discussions many states and locals have about the so-called death with dignity issues? So it's before the formal death declaration. How would your concept of this giving the benefit of a doubt exclude the death with dignity considerations, or is it consistent with it? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, in terms of the death with dignity, and I suppose you're looking here at various forms of voluntary euthanasia.
Yes.
I would have to say that whatever I might think of some of these decisions, and I am not a great proponent of voluntary euthanasia, I can assure you, that I think it is important that people are able to decide on what they would want. So I think their informed consent, their decision-making is extremely important. So I would err on that side. My emphasis perhaps on the other side would be to say, what about your loved ones? What about those close to you? What about the rest of people in the human community? Is your decision to go in this direction for voluntary euthanasia, what effect is that having on others? So I think this becomes a more nuanced discussion. But in terms of the importance of the decision of the person concerned, I would have to take that very seriously, even if I don't agree with their decision.
Yeah, and of course, even murkier then becomes an assessment of the mental capacity and ability
absolutely.
to make an informed decision. I mean,
absolutely.
My own father died of ALS, and it is just torment to see it and to go through it with a loved one, and so many issues come up.
Oh, yes. Look, I mean, there are a huge number of issues here. And one, and there's not, again, a simple answer. But I would very much emphasize that it is important to do what the person would like. Again, it doesn't mean to say I'm going to agree with it, or I think that it should legislate in that way. But I think that is an important ethical point. And I mean, again, as an anatomist, I mean, what anatomy departments are now facing are people who are donating their body after voluntary euthanasia. And then how do you deal with those bodies? They have been donated, which is the important point, but how do you deal with them? And again, there I would tend to say, well, if that is the legislation, if the society approves of that, if that is the decision of the person concerned, it's been done legally, etc., then we would accept their bodies. Does not mean to say that I personally would agree with it, but I think in terms of respecting people and respecting people with whom you disagree, that's an important point.
In other words, you're saying let's avoid, if we can, strict legislation that defines sharp boundaries.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Let's move on a little bit. We take your questions. Again, you have a reactions icon. Maybe you have to click on more or something and get to reactions, and then click on raise hand so I can see you. I can't track the chat, but I see some people are trying there. Dot, are you raising your hand over there? You can't find the icon, I take it.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Yeah, good. Gareth, thank you so much for your comments and your life of work on this. When I was teaching and working at Wheaton College, we used you as a great example of an individual who's thought deeply about many of these issues. I wonder if you would back up a bit and comment on God's choice for selecting the development of an embryo, that is conception and the development of an embryo, the way that he has chosen to do that. In other words, it's in God's providence. But would you comment on the value of it being God's choice to do it the way he did it? I don't see that as often in the bioethical issues debate as much as I'd like to sometimes.
Now, what are you actually asking? Did God choose appropriately or not?
Well, what went into his choice, and how do we value it because it was God's choice, just as we value other decisions in our existence. So does the fact that it's God's choice give us credence in the way that we think about this issue?
That's a fascinating question. I just making a note here. Well, there's no doubt that God has chosen us, human beings, to develop slowly. I mean, we know that. We know how prolonged childhood is, compared to certain other animals. So we know it's a very gradual process. And of course, that then has huge implications for what we are as adults and what human beings are able to do, as opposed to many other animals. When you come back then to the embryo, the thing is that during normal development, many things go wrong. I mean, there are a whole lot of things going on at all stages of development. And you look at some of them and you think, well, why would anyone have decided to do it that way? Or if you were of a completely different mindset, why did evolution do it in that way? Let's look at the Christian side. Why? You see, there are all. I mean, if I can come to the brain and go a bit, get into early development, first 2 years of development, so the first 2 years of life in any child, you look at the synaptic connections that are made between nerve cells. Vast numbers are made, and then they're lost. And that process, which at one level looks odd, why do you create this huge number of connections and then lose them? Well, the thing is that is a way of doing things which allows precise connections to be set up. And one of the problems you can sometimes get in early brain development is that many of these connections are not lost. And that ends up with a whole set of cognitive problems. So it's almost as though you throw out a whole lot of possibilities and then you get choices. And those choices are brought about genetically, but they're also brought about environmentally. And so it's this mixture of genetic and environmental, which is so important. So you can ask, well, why did God choose for synaptic connections to act in this way and brain cells and new nerve connections to be done in this particular way? And I mean, I can only give you an answer. That is something which works. But of course, working like that also means there are quite a lot of things that can go wrong. And so it is not an infallible method of setting up good connections. Now, you might say, well, could God have done it differently? I suppose, but it becomes a little bit meaningless. So I'm not sure, whether or not that's a help or not, or a complete hindrance, or complete irrelevance to your question. But I think it's something that, as you look and you see, yes, the huge number of things that can go wrong, and very often do go wrong. But on the other hand, they go wrong in an amazingly small number of cases. They do go wrong. And of course, that also leads you in the embryo and the fetus now to the large number of spontaneous abortions, which happen very, very early on. Often people are not even aware that they have lost a developing fetus. And so many of these genetic abnormalities, they are actually lost, and they're lost perfectly naturally. The ones that are not lost then tend to go through to childhood, adulthood and you can see then where things are not working. So why does God work in that way? I don't know. Could he have done it differently? Well, I would say possibly not. There's a big possibly there. I think we are working very much in areas of profound mystery here. But I'm grateful for the way in which we do have development. Don't know if you want to come back at that, Dorothy.
No, I appreciate your view. I was just wondering how you thought about it. By the way, I spent a wonderful 9 months in your fair country on a Fulbright.
Right. Okay.
And really enjoyed it immensely. So
good.
Thank you for your ongoing work. We have used your work as a model for many discussions with students at Wheaton College. So we're very grateful for your work.
It's nice to know that.
Okay, thank you very much, Dot. Carlos, were you trying to ask a question on chat here? Could you unmute yourself and ask it verbally?
No, I'd rather just go with a question that's on chat because I got a lot of background noise here.
Yeah, well, can you read it for us, or what? We can hear you pretty well.
Sure. Please elaborate on and Gareth, thank you very much for your presentation and your article. Please elaborate on the value of identifying a blastocyst as being potentially totipotent versus actually totipotent? They seem to provide a useful distinction for the pro-life and pro-choice debate.
I make that distinction because okay, something is totipotent when it is in an environment which allows that to happen and which is congenial. I use the other potentially totipotent to say, well, something, if you take that blastocyst out of that environment, out of an amenable environment, then it will not be totipotent. So
Gareth, just a minute for those in the audience who may not understand the implications of being totipotent, you could just remind the audience of what it means to be totipotent.
Totipotent is that it can develop into any of the various tissues of the body. So, and it has the full potential to, in other words, to become an individual eventually. But in order for that to happen, it has to be in an appropriate environment. Mm-hmm. So if you have got a blastocyst or an embryo at any early stages, which say is in the abdominal cavity, it will not develop. It is completely ectopic. It will not develop. And of course, it may have huge problems then for the mother. But it will not develop. So, and if you have early embryos which are in a freezer in the lab, they will not develop any further because they're not in a congenial environment. They have to be put into a woman's uterus. So that is why I make that distinction. And so it's one thing to say that, well, an embryo is an individual. An embryo will develop into a human. It will not develop if it is in the wrong environment. It has to be in an appropriate environment. And so, in other words, what this is saying is the environment is very important. And I think that very often in our discussions, we ignore the environment because, and the environment itself is as important as the actual blastocyst, whatever, is itself. So I'm trying to emphasize the importance of the environment. And so you have to have the environment in order to allow development to occur, and certainly to occur to its full extent.
And you're saying that non-natural environments are not feasible?
I am saying
in the laboratory?
Well, there possibly could be one day, but not at the moment.
Okay.
But what it also means is that if you are looking at in vitro fertilization or any process like that, that what is important are the media in which the embryo is developing. And so it is very important then, from a clinical and an ethical angle, actually to have the best environment that you can possibly have. And that's where quite a lot of the research comes into things. That if you're doing anything like in vitro fertilization, you want an environment which is going to be as good as possible so that that future individual will then be able to develop as normally as possible. That's why you have to have ongoing research. If you're going to have this sort of reproductive technology, you have to have ongoing research because that is extremely important. So you can't just say, well, the research that we did 20 years ago is fine, it's good enough. It's not. And that would not be acceptable in any sort of clinical ethics.
Okay. All right. Do we have any other questions on the floor? I get the impression, Gareth, that what you're telling us that it's so critical for us to value personhood and who persons who is a person, and to recognize the existence of boundaries and to look beyond those boundaries. But you're also making it very clear that there are no absolute or sharp boundaries that we can define, that everything is fuzzy and probably inherently so at all times. Is that fair?
It's reasonably fair, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, often look, I'd like to be able to say X is X, Y is Y, full stop, very clear boundary between them. But so often in anything biological, let alone ethical, there is not an absolute clear boundary. Now, I don't like feeling that, all I'm saying is be fuzzy and God bless you. I'm not saying that at all.
Right.
But there is a murkiness, there is an incompleteness, which we have to accept if we're going to be realistic.
Yeah. Okay, great. Oh, John Wood. Yes. Go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Randy. Fascinating, Garth. Really appreciate this. It's a very helpful conversation, and it strikes me, Dot pointed to a very important question. And as you said in yours, I think this is an area we really need a lot more attention and thinking on. So I appreciate it. I want to turn your attention to something you didn't talk about, but is there, and that's this human-machine interface with all of the kinds of technology that's coming to bear on that. From, I have a hearing challenge myself, so I pay attention to cochlear implants and all kinds of other things like that to improve hearing, right? And it as your hair disappears, you wonder, when did I become bald? How many hairs did I have to lose before I became bald? And then you ask the question, well, how many pieces of technology, hearing aids, glasses, cochlear implants, the pancreas, there's somebody doing some research, a high school student, on how to have a pancreas islet insert going on, and all of this stuff happening. And in particular, as you think about that, the machine-human interface, the brain organoid research, I don't know if you know anything about that, but what I'm seeing is they not only growing brain-like tissues in petri dish culture, but then hooking up these brain-like tissues to robotics and then programming and controlling. I mean, it strikes me that your questions about personhood really come to bear heavily on that kind of human-machine, biotic-machine interface. Do you want to comment on that?
It's not a small area.
True.
Yeah. To some extent, we're all cyborgs.
Right.
And you said you are. I am as well. Yes. It really is the extent to which we are cyborgs. And I mean, when one uses any form of technology, to what extent is it actually to what extent is it allowing you to function as you would like to function and as one would expect to function in very general terms now? So obviously, to have spectacles, to have cochlear implants, etc., that's trying to raise people up to where they would like to be, a sort of normality, within a very broad scale. Mm-hmm. Now, also, I think when you look at some of the brain implants, say with people with Parkinson's disease, etc., then I think these are very sophisticated, but they are trying to do exactly the same. In other words, they are trying to get rid of some of the pathology that is impeding the way in which people live. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to, if you like, you can't use 100% really, but you know what I mean. It's to try to raise you up towards your 100%, 90%, whatever it might be. Where I think you are starting to get into difficult territory is where people are wanting to improve on what people are. And to improve in, but again, even this is difficult. After all, if you look at sport, if you look at, runners or any athletics of any sort, after all, there are certain things within the sporting arena which you must not do because you are taking drugs, which is trying to improve your performance. But of course, as people have known for a very, very long time, you are brought up in some of the African countries on very, very high levels, over quite a few thousand meters. You are exceedingly good at long distance running. And your body is adapted, and in ways in which then people who are brought up in much lower environments, they're not. So here, what is normal here? And again, I think the sporting authorities often get themselves into huge difficulty with this. But I think that the problem then comes is when you are things like moral enhancement. Now, some people make a great deal of moral enhancement, ways in which we can improve people's morality. Now, I tend to be very skeptical of a lot of this, because I'm not sure how much of this actually works. But also, well, if you're going to improve people morally, there are all sorts of ways in which you can do it, which has nothing whatsoever to do with technology. And again, improving people, the environment, their social area, etc., etc. And that's all moral enhancement. So then to try and bypass all that technologically, I think is getting into extremely difficult territory, and where I would be very skeptical indeed of using technology to try and improve people like that. So again, if you say that people behave in certain ways, you've got your 90 to 100% band of what you think is normal, to try and make people 110% by technology, I think, well, once very often has to say, well, does it work? And will it work? And is it worth it? And also, if you were able to do that, very few people in the world would be able to use it. Most people would have no way of having access to these tools, the money, or whatever. So I think there are great issues here. So I think it's where people are trying to push you above what is considered to be a generally normal, healthy level within society. That's where you get problems. Not trying to remedy defects, whether defects in your eye, your hearing, your heart, whatever. So, we've generally got no issues in putting in pacemakers, in putting in artificial valves into people's hearts, because again, we're trying to make them perform normally or some form of regular way. So I think there's that, to me, is where it really becomes very important. What are you actually trying to do? Quite apart from the fact whether you can actually do it. It does seem to me that a lot of the great discussion in the bioethical literature about some of this moral enhancement is probably a complete waste of time because it's not going to be feasible anyway.
Well, I think, Gareth, this may be a good place to put in a plug for your article on transhumanism, a closely related topic here. That you published it in the June 2020 issue of the journal. So among your many publications in the journal, you did address the transhumanism aspect of that particular question, right? Okay.
Randy, if I just might, Gareth, thank you for that, because I as I started, this is a critical set of conversations that we need to be engaging, not only among ourselves as science professionals, but also engaging our colleagues and our pastors and our churches. There needs to be richer conversations around these kinds of issues. One you touched on, we've spent a lot of time on the beginning of life, but at the end of life, a pacemaker. A pacemaker is a wonderful technology. I'm guessing, looking across the audience, that there are a couple of pacemakers out there. But we walked through the end of life with a dear friend, and thought she was leaving us on several occasions. and didn't, and then completely suffered for another 6 weeks. And it turned out it was the pacemaker that was keeping her there. So the very thing that kept her alive and gave her quality of life and a wonderful life, in the end, gave her a very challenging and painful and difficult ending. So that's a conversation. How do you end well? So how do you begin well? How do you live well? And how do you end well? And so again, thank you for your writing. It's very helpful for us to think.
Yeah, I think whatever society, well, any sort of reasonably well-off society you look at, vast sums of money are spent on the last week of life. And much of this is utterly unjustified.
Okay. Any other questions? It's almost time to close here. Oh, we got one more from Earl Godfrey. Yes, Earl? Can you unmute yourself and maybe turn your camera on so we can see you?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
My video card is on the fritz, so if I start to look like I'm having a seizure, I'll turn it off.
We can hear you.
So, Gareth, this has been very helpful. I've read a couple of your books, and I now find myself teaching developmental biology to a group of students who do in vitro fertilization in a unique PhD program here at Eastern Virginia Medical School. And I have sort of avoided the ethical questions, and I have to say that at first it made me nervous that some of them were doing research on human embryos, early embryos, obviously, in culture. But I agree with you that if you're going to do IVF, you need to do research to determine the best conditions for the development of these embryos and in a normal way. What I'd like to ask you about kind of goes beyond that. I'm getting more open to it. I haven't agreed to be on any of their committees yet, but beyond that, there are a number of labs that are developing what they call synthetic embryos using stem cells. One of the most prominent is Dr. Zuniga Gutz, who's at Cambridge University. And it's really neat stuff because you can create an embryo that from 3 different types of stem cells. Now I need to turn this off. That will develop through gastrulation, although it stops at that point. But probably this will be continued. Those are mouse embryos, but the next step would be to do it in human. So I just like to get your thoughts on that, those kinds of procedures. And obviously, there are lots of interesting research questions that could be asked with them. But there's also the possibility that someone would try to implant those so that they might develop into a baby, a person. And, so that's another frontier that's not being discussed much, at least from what I've heard.
Let's see, Gareth, did we lose you in the middle of that? Are you still there? Gareth, I think. Can we hear you? Can you hear us? I think somehow I saw his connection was weakened, and I don't see him on the list right now. I'm sorry, Earl. That was a very excellent comment here, and I wanted his view. So I'm not sure exactly what happened here. Dana, did you notice anything? Maybe not. Okay, wait, he's in the waiting room. Yeah, let's get him back in.
Yeah, he just joined again.
Yeah, we lost the connection temporarily. Okay, Gareth, we lost you for a little bit there. Let's see.
He's unmute.
Yeah, you need to unmute yourself so we can hear you. You're somewhere. There you go. All right, you're back on, Gareth.
I have no idea what happened.
Okay, so I don't know. Did you catch enough of Earl's question, or I'm not sure exactly at what point your connection?
No,
dropped.
I don't think I did.
Okay,
oh, my,
so
let's see.
I'll make it shorter.
You can say, yeah. Sorry.
I'm teaching students who do in vitro fertilization in a unique online PhD program, and they do research on mouse embryos, but sometimes on human embryos. And I'm growing more comfortable with that, given what you said about having to make the conditions as ideal as possible so that they will develop normally. What I wanted to ask you is, going beyond that, there are people doing research on what they call synthetic embryos, which are embryos created with stem cells, with different types of stem cells. They could be genetically modified or not. This is mostly being done in mouse, but I think if it hasn't been, it will be done in human too. And so far, they can get those to develop in the mouse embryo up through the gastrulation, although they don't implant or develop any further. But they're pushing the boundaries of that. And I wondered if, that some days there might be a possibility that these embryos could be implanted and develop into a human, which raises all kinds of ethical questions. But what do you think of synthetic embryo research and its value and its ethics?
Yes, there are a number of different forms of this. One of them are what people call eye blastoids. Mm-hmm. And these are what I call embryo models. And the eye blastoids, and they are actually been done, this is actually in an Australian lab, and this is using human embryo, using human material, which of course they come from, so they don't come from embryos, but they are very much from sort of stem cells. So they are models. In Australia, they are being dealt with in a very conservative, very cautious fashion, because they are saying that they must abide by all of the regulations for embryo research, even though it is not clear that they're embryos in any meaningful sense. So as far as I can see, doing this sort of work at the moment is fine, because it is very basic embryological research. At the moment, there is no way in which anyone could or would try and take it further and try and develop it into any what might be called individuals. So I think as embryo models, I think they have huge potential. I think they're very interesting, but they are models. And also, I think I would use the word model because they are not identical to actual developing blastocysts. There are differences, and those differences are actually quite important. So they are extremely good models. They are not perfect models, but there is no way in which anyone would try and take them further because of the very subtle, important differences with ordinary developing blastocysts.
Okay. Will that someday be overcome?
One can never say no, never. But it would, one can never say never. It does not look at the moment as though it will be overcome, certainly not in the foreseeable future. Even though these developments have been very rapid, papers are coming out all the time in these areas. But I think at the moment, I could say they are very, very far removed from being realistic human models.
Okay. Final comment or all? Or
thank you. Yeah, I mean they are developing rapidly and in the technology, and the most recent iteration that I'm aware of in the mouse involves, the development of a model that includes the extra embryonic tissues, not just the embryonic tissues. And that would have the potential for implantation. But again, even in the mouse, it doesn't progress after gastrulation. So I think we're still within your 21-day, suggested period.
Yeah, and I think one does need to make the point too, a general point, is that however much you can do with, let us say, mouse embryos, that does not then or no necessity mean you could do the same with human embryos, not for ethical reasons, not for theological reasons, but for purely scientific reasons. Right. Human embryos are far, far more difficult to get developing in the lab than are things like mouse embryos. There are real differences here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Earl. We've got 2 minutes left. Just enough time for Jennifer Wiseman to put her question on the table. She's been trying to get it through the chat line here. But Jennifer, we'd much rather hear from you in person. Why don't we give you the last word in terms of putting an unanswerable question on the table?
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I'm not going to turn on my camera because I've been working out and I'm a sweaty mess, but I wanted you to just comment on another element of your article, which is about, respecting the person, or what does it mean to be a person for someone who's died a long time ago. And, you talked about the challenges of study of human bodies that were buried centuries ago or many years ago versus the dignity of that person who has no say on what's happening to their body, their bones. And so I don't really have a well-formulated question, but since it was in the article, I just wondered if you had anything to say about that part of the periphery of personhood.
Thank you very much for that, Jennifer. When we are dealing with these, the skeletal material from a long time ago, obviously the realm of biological anthropologists, what becomes very important here are whether or not there are any living descendants or people who you could say are descendants and who would like the material return to them in some shape or form. And so I think, again, then we get to the point of, are there living people who can speak on behalf of these long dead people? And so I think if there are descendants, or descendants even in terms of tribal descendants, doesn't have to be, of course, individuals, then I think you are looking to the living people to see what they would require and what they would like. But I think even when that is not the case, I think there's a huge amount of ethical debate now within biological anthropology circles, and they are very much aware of ethical issues. And what they will then say is they would, whatever they can get from the material, then they would try and make this relevant for either the groups themselves or people who might be there, or just to tell us, the humanity, how these people lived, etc., etc. So they're trying to get useful material out of it to help and to assist others, particularly those who are closely related or might be closely related, but even if that's not the case, to make it available. And I think they're very much aware of the human community and the importance of the human community. And so I think the time when biological anthropologists in particular simply worked as scientists per se and couldn't care less about anyone else, that is no longer the case, because we are interested in the human community, particularly those who might be close to these people who once lived.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all, everyone. And we've come to time that we normally close. Dana, I'd like to ask you to post one more link on there, and that is to the discussion forum for this particular topic. So if, as you sleep on it tonight, you think of more questions, we do have a discussion forum set up that you can continue the discussion. Or Gareth, if there's one more thought you want to add at some point, this forum is open and will remain open to continue the discussion. So let's see, Dana, if you could get that on there. There it is. Okay, so people, and by the way, we will post the chat and the links will be live on that chat. So if you open up the chat files, these links will be available to you. So with that, Gareth, we really thank you. And you've got a whole Sunday in front of you. And for the rest of us, we need to change our clocks. And I want to thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you next month on April 8th. Thank you and farewell.
Thank you very much.